about one's craziness. So thank you for your kind words. Hello, friends. Welcome to the second Race, Science, and the Church session of this webinar. Last week, Greg and Drew began unpacking the difficult history of race in science and how the ideas produced by this approach shaped our human interactions, even when we can empirically prove that race is not necessarily biological, but rather a social construct. Today, as we continue our discussion, we will explore how science as a social construct has impacted individuals, people, groups, and communities. As I mentioned last week, the subject of race is always a difficult one to address. It has the potential for interactions that could be perceived as threatening, it could be perceived as offensive, and it can even generate intense emotions, memories, or anxiety on different individuals. I want you to know that we acknowledge these experiences and emotions as valid, and if they need to be expressed throughout the day, that's perfectly okay. But please know that our aim is not to cause pain, but to provide a safe space for discussion and learning that is devoid of threat, to foster growth and equality. As we move towards our first presentation of the day, I just want to share a little bit of research behind what we're doing today. Researchers describe discrimination and oppression as a dominant group using their power to restrict access to resources and other social structures for minority groups, thus creating an environment that is delimited by glaring systemic disparities. And we talk about this because people of color in our context have been on the receiving end of this long discriminatory practices. Moreover, researchers have discovered links between these instances of discrimination and health-related issues such as increased blood pressure, heart problems, lower childbirth weight, anxiety, depression, and other mental health problems and other problems that relate to the health and well-being of individuals. In our first presentation of the day, Dr. Fuller will address the impact of race on health directly. Dr. Fuller has earned a BA in biology and a PhD in microbiology and immunology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and has conducted postdoctoral research in virology at the University of Chicago. She is a Ford Foundation Fellow, a Fulbright Faculty Scholar, and an inaugural alumna of Women in Academic Leadership at the UM Medical School. But her work reaches beyond the academy to implement scientific and medical discoveries into wider use. She's an associate professor of microbiology and immunology in the Medical School and African Studies Center member, and she is a virologist and an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So without anything else, just give the floor to Dr. Fuller. Dr. Fuller, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Thank you for this invitation to be part of this very important conversation that you're embarking on. Probably one of the most important of our time that I believe we, particularly as Christians, are called to and perhaps called to lead. So thank you so much for what you're doing here. I was happy to hear that you are already had part one, which was to look at the definition of race and what it is and what it's not. And so what I hope to do today is to just help to unpack how what is happening and has happened in at least the USA over the last several centuries have led to impacts on science or impact on health that is disparate and really has to change for all of our well-being. So being a scientist and a professor, we always have pictures and slides. And so what I'm going to do is give you some visuals, and then hopefully there will be time for discussion and questions. And as was said, I'm so grateful for this safe space which is designed to help us really call in and talk to each other about very difficult issues and perceptions and things that are historical, that may be erroneous, that need to be corrected, and then to begin together to ask the question, how can we change these things? So I'm hoping that I can get the technology to work well here and share my screen. I think you can see that, is that right? All right, so let's see. I have only one screen. Usually I have two, so I hope I can navigate this well with this one. All right, so race, science, and the church. And as was mentioned, I'm at the University of Michigan in the medical school as a virologist there. So I wanted to just alert you that pandemics, which is what we're in with COVID, and I'm going to use COVID as a springboard to talk about this issue of what is the effect of race and racism and situations that are institutionalized and systemic around race, what effect that has on health. So just to give you a background, we've always had pandemics. The COVID pandemic is nothing different except that it's a new virus that we haven't seen before. So this just summarizes the deaths from various microbial plagues or microbial pandemics since we've been recording time. And so the COVID-19, which is the emergence of a new virus, is now around almost 6 million known deaths globally from this new virus. So it would actually be over here somewhere if we could actually move it. And so how do we get there and why do we get there? Now, I realize I don't have to spend much time on this because you already talked about it last week, but what is the official definition of race? And so just as a quick review, often we think of it as a person's self-identification with one or more social groups. So it's a social construct, but it is not based on biological features. And so we may have the option of saying we're white or Black or African American or any of these other areas, or we may have multiple identities or list other. The concept, as you may have heard, was first emerged in the 17th century when there was a lot of global exploration and colonization. But in the 20th century, when we could analyze DNA and genes, all the data indicate that there's no physical variations that allow people to fit into a racial model of categorizing people. So there are no genes that can identify distinct groups that fit these conventional race groups. DNA analysis show that genetically humans are more similar, more common than different. As a matter of fact, only 1% of genetic difference between any two humans typically. And even if you look at widely geographically spaced areas, the difference is never above about 8%. So these overlapping traits have nothing to do with there's no genetic relationship between such things such as skin color and hair texture. They don't aggregate or migrate together. And so the conclusion from scientists over the last century and a half is that race is a social-based, systematic, institutionalized set of beliefs and attitudes with no basis in biological evidence. So the bottom line is whatever's happening to us in health and other issues, we are all in this together. We cannot separate based on any divisions among humans due to genes. We are all created by God in the image of God, as those of you who are here and I believe. And so I want now to move into what are some of these health disparities. And being a virologist, I can't help but put in a slide about viruses, just to let you know that all viruses have to reproduce in cells, human or living cells. And so because we're in a COVID pandemic, this is an infected cell. This orange blob is an infected cell with all these little projections. And all these little yellow dots are new viruses that were produced by that one cell. So imagine that when you get infected or a person gets infected along the nasal and throat, and all these cells, many of them are producing virus, we're making millions of virus, and that gets put out into the air when we breathe out, particularly if we don't have any barrier there to block the virus going out. And this is just, again, another area of the cell where hundreds of viruses are coming out of one particular cell. So I used that to introduce the COVID pandemic, which, as you know, emerged in 2019 and became a global pandemic in 2020 in March. And this shows you that the USA hasn't done so well in terms of the number and the impact of COVID cases and diseases. But what I really want you to take away from this picture is that COVID, as well as coronavirus infections, has helped to unveil what we already knew, that there are disparities and differences in health based on factors that seem to correlate with race, but probably have to do with other things we'll talk about. So this is just an example, some early data from Chicago with looking at the number of cases. And this is the cases among Black or non-Latinx persons compared to the cases among white or Latinx or Asian or others. You see cases are high, you see deaths thus far and are very, very high. And another way to look at this is if we look at the state population on this side, the left, and the number of African Americans that died due to COVID early on the right. So in Louisiana, the population is 32% African American. But if we looked at the total number of deaths from COVID-19 at this point, which was May 2020, 70% of those deaths were among African Americans. Or in my home state of Michigan, 14% population, 41% of the early deaths to COVID were among African Americans. What is the cause of this? There has to be some reason. This is terribly alarming. And what we find is that even with more modern data, more recent data, that these differences remain. And so here we see data or demographics on death and cases and hospitalizations from June 2021 up to June 2021. And if we use white non-Hispanic as the baseline, we see that African Americans are 2.9 times more likely to be hospitalized. First Nations or Native Americans are 3.3 times, and Hispanic Americans 2.8. Look at the death rate. So there's got to be something going on here, particularly if we say that this is not based on genetic or biological factors. And what we realize is that COVID unveiled again anew what we already knew, that there are major health inequities. And I focus on African Americans because that's what I've done this presentation mostly for, but you could choose whatever group you wanted, First Nations or Latino, Latina. You could choose any group you wanted and you would see a disparity there compared to non-Hispanic whites. So I won't go through all of these, I'll just summarize these, but health inequities are such that asthma is 20 times more likely to occur among African Americans, with people dying from asthma at 3 times the rate. Heart disease, 25% more likely to die from heart disease if you're African American in the USA. Maternal mortality, we'll get to that. Diabetes, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Prostate, cervical, or breast cancer, 40, 52, or men are twice more likely to have cervical cancer if they're Black, to die of cervical cancer if they're Black in America. Strokes are 44% more likely to cause death for African Americans. What is this? Why is this? How do we reduce these racial and ethnic health disparities? I believe we have to improve healthcare quality. We have to improve accessibility, advocacy, and affordability. This is just, and I'm going to go through this really quickly so we have some time to talk, but this is just some of the data broken out on what I just showed you. Prostate cancer diagnoses, cases in white males compared to Black males, or diabetes among white, Black, or Hispanic, 24.1% high or percentage for African Americans compared to 15.5% of the population with diabetes in the USA, or 20% of Hispanics. And then we look at asthma, realizing that Black Americans are 3 times more likely to die from asthma. And this, remember, this isn't genetic based, this is environment, this is stress related, this is access to healthcare. This is hypertension. So the non-Hispanic Black is in the light blue color, and you see that's higher for whatever reasons. Is that stress? Is that diet? Is that location? This one just breaks my heart because you would think that in the developed country of the USA, this would not be happening. But this is mothers who die at birth during childbirth in the USA. And this data is from 2019. So for every 100,000 births, 15 white women or 13 white women lose their lives. For Black women, out of every 100,000, that's 41. And this turns out not to be broken down by economics. This is across all economic and socioeconomic levels. You have women in here who are attorneys or professors or administrators or teachers. And that's true also for Indigenous women or First Nations. And then if we look at the infant mortality, we see that a child who's Black is twice more likely to die as an infant than whites. So these disparities are real, and they cover a wide range of areas. So it brings our attention to what factors then contribute to the health and wellness inequities that we see, not only for African Americans, but other people who are not white or of European descent in the US. And so here are some of the factors, and we need to think about these socioeconomical factors. What jobs do we have? Where are we? How much do we get paid? Does that pay allow a certain level of life and support of yourself and your family to have you live in safe spaces and have access to nutritious food? Underlying medical conditions, well, those are not just happening, they happen for reasons. Access to medical care. We can think about whether people could get tested early on in COVID, or whether they were sent home and said, well, you don't have enough of the symptoms for me to admit. There were differences between whether people of color could get help versus people who were majority people when they presented at their doctor's office or on the telemedicine cases. The misinformation that circulates. And then certainly the one thing we all can work on is the systemic and institutionalized anti-Blackness that emerged as another pandemic in 2020, right along with the COVID pandemic. So what can we do about these? And I believe the church has a huge influence and responsibility to address these issues. I believe God is holding us accountable for this. The last slide in this series is that if we look back over our history and realize that the income, which is a huge piece of how well you can eat, where you live, what you do, what kinds of stressors or de-stressors you have, this blew me away when I realized, this changed my life when I looked at this. So this is the average household income for African Americans and whites. And this is from 2018 data for the average African American households, around 40,000. For the average white American household, it's around 70,000. But then look at the over time, the accumulated wealth for these two, quote, racial groups. Again, not biological, but based on social constructs and social factors. In 1990, the average accumulated wealth for whites was around $400,000, everything, home, bank accounts, land, etc. By 2015, that number had arisen to about 850,000. For Black Americans, that number in 1990 was around 100,000 total accumulated wealth. By 2015, it had not changed. So what is the reason for this? What's the root cause of this growing household wealth indifference that affects everything? And so this is just a simple slide that said, we are dealing with a systemic institutionalized problem as manifested by these numbers and how this impacts everything else, as we talked about in these factors. Reality in that picture I just showed you says that there are great differences between what people have and what people need. Equality would say, well, let's give everybody the same thing. Let's give equal opportunity. Well, it would benefit some people more than others, but it would not allow those who have the greatest need to be able to participate in a way. And this is just, I describe this as Uncle John taking his two nephews to the ball game. One is 10, one is 4. The 10-year-old can see on the box, but the 4-year-old can't see. Equality gives them both something to stand on. The 4-year-old still can't see. Equity then, giving people what they need, allows all of these to enjoy the ball game. It may require a little bit more for the 4-year-old because he's starting from such a deficit. And then justice, which is what we need to work for which I believe God holds us accountable, would simply remove the barriers between us, and including those barriers set up by racial constructs. I just want to give you these resources, which I hope will be very useful as you continue this discussion. One is an amazing book called 400 Souls, which documents the community history. It's 80 chapters written completely independent. You could start anywhere in the book. But it talks about what really has happened in our country, the history we don't hear about, the differences in laws, the differences in how systemic and institutionalized practices were allowed to prosper. We saw that when we saw the Minnesota killing of George Floyd and many others that have been unveiled in the anti-Blackness of 2020. And this is a book that we've had for many years. Lies my teachers told me about American history and things like we were all taught that the Mayflower landed in 1620 in the US, and we know how many people were there and their names. But there was also a ship called the White Lion. And let me just ask you, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second. How many of you have ever heard of the White Lion? If you have, just wave your hand at me. Nobody's heard of it. Well, that was the ship that landed in 1619 that we know had the first Africans brought in as chattel. And in Hampton, Virginia, they landed there. We don't even know how many people there were, but we know they were sold as property to help the colonists to continue to build there. And so if the Mayflower is remembered in history, shouldn't the White Lion also be remembered? Why do we omit that? Why do we not talk about that? Are we ashamed? Are we afraid? Or we just don't know? And I would say it's for all those reasons. So that's why we have to have the kinds of conversations that we're having now to get to the truth. I believe the scriptures say the truth will make you free, right? And Christ has come that we may be free. He who is set free by the Son is truly free indeed. So if there's any place we're going to be able to discuss these things and really think about solutions that may work to change the way things have been and to learn the truth, we need to do this together. And then the last set of resources are some that we put together through my team of Trust Messengers, which is Race in Medicine, about what COVID unveiled with a wonderful physician in New York City, Generation Trauma, about the experience of First Nations from one of my colleagues, Judy Munn, and then just conversations about COVID. And so I will stop sharing here, but I want to say that these health disparities just don't happen. There are reasons for them, and we have to really be brave and dig down to the reasons. Analogy I like to use from a biological point of view is if you turn over a big stone, you'll see the little insects scurrying to get out of the light. And I believe what happened in 2020 with the COVID-19 pandemic and the anti-Blackness unveiled in our country, the systemic anti-Blackness is not only in our police system, but in our legal system, things that have been set up to keep the people in power and to restrain or oppress, or I think the term that was used was to restrict access to resources. That has to change. And you and I may be used to certain things, but I believe the generation of my children and maybe your children and grandchildren are whole different people, and they will not live that way. So I will stop here and close my comments with a statement that I heard when I was a new professor at the University of Michigan. I kind of adopted from Dr. Martin Luther King, that says, we either will learn to live together as brothers and sisters, which is what I think God meant when he created us all in their image, male and female, he created them. Or Dr. King says, we will die together as fools. And I, for one, think we have so many challenges on this earth, from climate change to many other things, that we cannot afford not to work together to solve them and use all the resources and gifts and graces that have been placed in the multitude of people. So thank you for your time and attention. I would be happy to engage in whatever conversation we have time to do.
Thank you, Dr. Fuller. Instead of going into our breakout rooms, we thought that our time would be better served if the whole group had access to Dr. Fuller to ask and interact with her. So the floor is open. Just go ahead and either raise your hand or unmute yourself, and let's go ahead and try to have this conversation. I think that there's several. I think that Carmen Cox, it's here somewhere, raising her hand, and then Stephen said brooding also has his hand raised. So there's the first two questions. Carmen, go ahead, and then we'll deal with Stephen.
Thank you, Ed, and thank you, Dr. Fuller, for the education. What would you say to parents who are adamant about not allowing their white children to be taught their real history in school?
Yes, so I think what you're talking about is the
critical race theory.
Critical race theory pushback. Yes, so it could almost be predicted that people would. So I think somebody says that the oppressors never want to give up power. It must be demanded by those who are oppressed. And you know, we are Christians, and I don't think that we like to think about demanding things. But if we look at what Jesus did, right? He taught people to change, but he taught them out of love. And so parents who don't want their children to study critical or race truth, like books about things like The White Lion or Before the Mayflower by LaRon Bennett, who talks about that book, The White Lion. What are they trying to prevent? I mean, what is it? And I'll just give you a James Baldwin quote, and I hope I don't mess it up. But it says, maybe the reasons people cling to hate so much. And I say that because in that situation, people are trying to protect their children from learning something that is really truth, but they don't want to admit that it's truth because either it's embarrassing, it's damaging, or it's hurtful. So James Baldwin said, the reason people cling to hate so much is because if they let go of the hate, then all that would be left would be the pain. And what does that mean? That means that if I can't achieve, for whatever reasons, I haven't achieved something, but you haven't achieved either, and you're of a different race, you're a quote, a minority, I don't use that term, but you're a person of color, then I can say, well, you haven't achieved because, you know, I'm better than you, and I know I'm better than you because I know that I'm white, and race is a definition of that. But if I say that we are equal, there's no reason that white should be different than black, then I'm right there too. So what's my excuse for not achieving, right? So I think in many cases, people are afraid. Many cases, they don't believe what's being said. And we have all been so processed to believe the things we have been taught that even I have to catch myself. Some of you may, and I bet Mrs. Carwell or Carmen, if I may call you that, you probably remember this rhyme from Jump Rope. I grew up in North Carolina, and it says, if you're white, you're all right. You know the rest of it.
If you're brown,
if you're brown, stick around. If you're black, get back.
Get back.
Yeah. And so it's like, what? I mean, what does that mean? You know, we say it as a child, but what does that mean when you grow up in how does it fit into your whole way of perceiving the world? My children never learned that, so they have a different perception. So I'm just simply saying that I think that fear, that goal or need to protect our children comes from wanting to hold on to the systems that have protected us and given some a hand up and others not over centuries. And the truth is hard. The truth will not always be pleasant, but we will all be better, and we can all use our gifts and graces and work together if we can live and learn together, learn the truth.
Excellent. Stephen?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, one of my questions a little more on the biological and scientific end. As you explained, genes don't differentiate as a base of race, but it seems like when you have those, the image of, you know, the people standing on the things, that's all about environment and how environment affects things. So I think what you're saying is that we have to look at the epigenetics that are involved in changing the genes from an external rank, otherwise poverty, access to medicine, well, that would all be considered epigenetics. Is that, am I understanding that is what you're trying to get at?
No, so epigenetics is not what you're saying. What you're
Okay.
saying are social economical factors that have nothing to do with the genes. So what I'm saying, and what I think others explained last week, is that the race things that we talk about, like hair color or eye color, those do not sort with race. I mean, we may say people with more curly or kinky hair are African descent, but you can find people in other parts of the world that had nothing to do with Africa, except everybody came from Africa at one point. So genes do not allow us to put people into race, and that's what epigenetics tried to do. So epigenetics is partly based on saying we can define some things based on genes, and that has been completely disproven. The epigenetic theory has been disproven over and over and over again. What we are saying is that, and this gets deeper into some biomedical things, there may be some things that do seem to segregate with race, but it's not because of race genes. It's because race also defines the systemic and institutionalized issues that happen to people, but it's not a particular gene that we can find. I will give you a very quick example. Our son is 36 years old. I hope he doesn't mind my saying this, but about 3 or 4 years ago, he was diagnosed with a disease or a condition where he has too much iron in his blood. His hemoglobin holds too much iron. And it doesn't hurt you if you know about it. You just have to reduce your iron intake. But it turns out when he was sent to a specialist, and the specialist, a white male, came into the room and he was looking at the chart and he looked up and saw my son, who's my skin tone or darker. And he looked at the record and he looked up, he says, "Are you Brian Calden?" He says, "Yes." So the diagnosis did not fit Brian because I think it's hyperchromatosis. I probably said it wrong, but that typically is a European disease. And here's this beautiful brown guy who has hyperchromatosis, right? It's a recessive gene. You have to have 2 copies. Your mother and your father would have to give you the gene in order for the phenotype to show up in you. So that said, what is this thing? You can't look at this person who's this beautiful brown skinned man and say that he's African. He has Scottish heritage, he has Irish heritage, and he has both these genes that allow him to have this typically European blood situation. So epigenetics has been shown not to matter. It's really more so how we wrap factors around what we perceive as race.
Thank you.
So epigenetics has been disproven completely.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we still have a few more minutes with Dr. Fuller. Any more questions?
I see a couple of hands, yeah. Stephen and Emily, I believe. Oh, Emily, okay, Stephen's already asked.
Hey, Emily.
Hi, I was wondering if any textbook company had been contacted about rewriting some of these history books, because they are, they are just, they allow maybe one sentence on the strife of the African American, coming to the U.S. And it's just, we aren't taught that. And, you grow up believing that that you are studying, it has what you need to know. And in fact, it's just not.
It's wrong. Yes, I don't know, but I do know that it is incumbent upon parents and churches and communities to teach the truth. So the resources I recommended, that 400 Souls, Lies My Teachers Told Me, there are many others. I would encourage you to get those and read those and share those, because the fact that we are told certain things, like the Civil War wasn't about slavery. I was taught that in the 8th and 9th grade growing up in North Carolina, and it was absolutely about slavery. I mean, it was about states' rights to have slaves or not, and the economical pressure. So we have to be we have to push back. If somebody's coming to the school board and saying we want these books taken out, somebody told me recently their sister, a librarian, spent hours documenting the books that the mothers group wanted to have taken out were award-winning books. And so she went to the school board and with her data that she took her time to do to say, why would we take these books out of the school when these are the things our children ought to be educated on? We have got to, and to me, that's part of what the church should do as well. Thank you so much for that important question.
Stephen Speakman, I think you have a question as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Fuller. I remember when I first encountered that information around disparities in maternal and infant health remaining consistent across socioeconomics. That was really striking to me. And just was curious if you could talk more about how you interpret that data. I know the information I was initially seeing was talking about, just the stress of being a Black woman in American society. I imagine the possibility of unconscious medical bias around pain or around risk factors could also be at play, but curious how you would interpret that sort of data.
Thank you for that question. I too, when I first heard that or read it, was shocked. And I said, I don't know if I believe this. But then once I thought about the women that I know who have given birth early, premature birth, or who had to be taken, had to have bed rest because they didn't want to go into preeclampsia or other things. And then I thought about my own life. And the truth of the matter is that stress can cause physiological changes. And so let me see if I can quickly give you this analogy. If indeed a woman who is pregnant and carries a child through 9 months, her hormone levels have to get from a baseline to a certain level in order for the body to say, now induce labor, right? Well, if you start out with a certain higher level of that hormone from the flight or fight response, which we all have, and that's what African Americans and other people of color do in this country. You're already starting out at a higher baseline because of all the little daily stresses. Is the camera on me as I'm shopping in the store? Is the person going to cross the street because I'm walking down the street? Am I, all these little stresses. If I speak up in this faculty meeting, will I be thought to be saying something that's ridiculous because I'm who I am? So all these little second guesses start women, particularly Black women and women of color, at a higher level. And so it's easy for your body to say, okay, you've already reached the threshold that it's time to push out this child at 6.5 or 7 months, when in reality, the child is not developed and your hormones shouldn't be that high. But because you started out at a higher level, you are more likely to go into early labor. And those little cuts, what do they say, death by 1,000 cuts, are absolutely real, because our society systematically discredits and has never recognized people of color, never recognized the equity and equality that God meant when he created people in their image. So I'll just stop there. I hope that was a short, clear answer.
Yeah, thank you.
We have 3 more minutes, I think. Trying to squeeze one more question, if at all possible. If there are no more questions, I guess that we will
Marianne
thank.
has a question. Marianne has a question.
Mary
Oh, there
Ann,
you go. Oh, go ahead, Marianne.
I used to work for physicians in Cleveland, Ohio, who would leave work, go over and work at the free clinic across the street on evenings and weekends. Many of them did. And then all of a sudden, free clinics were gone. And I'm wondering if, since you're in the medical community, are you aware of any thought to bring those back? Because poverty is killing people and causing such bad health outcomes, including pregnancies. I just wondered whether there was any hope that they could get free medical care.
thank you for that question. I am not a physician, so I unfortunately don't know the clinical piece. But what I can say is poverty is not something that is race-based at all from a biological point of view. It is based on the socioeconomical factors that allow people to live in a certain place, to only have certain jobs, to not get a mortgage, or to not be able to have their home valued at a level where it would allow them to have the home equity value that they can borrow from. So I want to say that free clinics are needed wherever people are in need of basic medical care.
Yes,
But
they
even when care is not free, we have to advocate for good care. I mean, there are things like Black folks' pain is different than white folks. We can tolerate more pain than white folks. Those things are untrue. And so we've got to dismantle those things. And I just like to leave you with the thought that we are all a part of this. I mean, I address myself all the time. What are you thinking? That's the reason the Race and Medicine series got started, because I wanted to go back and bring forward those things that we don't know about and talk to people and really get an understanding, to call in people and say, let's sit down and talk about this. This is going to be painful. It may not be fun, but I declare that we will all be better off on the other end. And I thank you for what you're doing with this series. And I'm so grateful to have been a part of the conversation here today.
Outstanding. Dr. Fuller, thank you for such
Thank
a
you.
wonderful presentation and for your time. I think that our next presentation of the day will be completed by Drew. And Drew will be talking about how does race impact our minds, issues of implicit bias and the like. So I just want to give the floor to Drew and go from there.
Thank you, Ed. First, I want to thank you, Dr. Fuller, again for joining us. A big part of what Science for the Church is about is building connections between scientists and church leaders. And I thank you for the connection you've made with all of these church leaders in this workshop, and hopefully helping them to see ways individuals like yourself can help them in their work with ministry. So thank you very much, Dr. Fuller. So what I wanted to do is kind of continue this conversation that Dr. Fuller started. Continuing on this idea we developed last week that race is not biological. It is not something that can be explained biology, but yet race is something that impacts us. It can impact our biology, physically, health. And what I want to focus on particularly is how it can impact our minds. And so that was an idea that was referenced in the video I shared last week, which I commend to you. We're going to share some resources with you through a bibliography after today's session. I encourage you to look at that. It develops that idea very clearly, and I think it's one of the most important take-homes that I hope we all bring from this discussion, that while race is not explained by our biology, it is still very real as a social construct, and it impacts us. And specifically, it impacts our minds. And so I want to spend some time talking about cognitive bias, as it's known. Are folks fairly familiar with this concept, cognitive bias? Is that something folks have heard of? So cognitive biases are essentially shortcuts our brains make. They develop when we're young to help us navigate the world. We can't possibly pay attention to all the information that reaches us at any given moment. We simply don't have the right level of attention. And so we need these shortcuts to help us know what information do we pay attention to? How do we process that? What do we remember? What things do we recall from memory in certain situations? And they're really important in helping us know how do we react quickly in a seemingly urgent situation. So cognitive biases are involved in all of these, and psychologists have identified well over 100, it may be several hundred now through various studies. And some you're probably familiar with. One of my favorites, it's a relatively innocent one. Some of these you might say are good. They really help us navigate the world. Some of them are bad. They have pretty pernicious effects. One that's fairly neutral is what is known as the Lake Woebegone effect. And that's the idea that we're all better than average. At least we think we are. So there's a famous study that was done several years back. 93% of Americans, so over 9 out of 10 of us in this room, think we're better than average drivers. Now, if you know anything about statistics, you know that's simply not possible. But this is one of the ways our minds help us not only understand numbers and statistics and probabilities, but also kind of create our sense of ourselves in the world as we assume we're better than average. Our kids are better than average, like the children at Lake Wobegon that Garrison Keillor described. This is a way we learn to navigate the world through a cognitive bias. One that you're probably more familiar with that gets a lot more attention is confirmation bias. The way that we look at arguments and we pull out the things that confirm our preconceived notions rather than really giving a fair assessment of arguments or counter arguments. So with Michigan and Ohio folks, I'm going to argue that Northwestern is the best athletic program in the Big Ten, my alma mater. And you can share lots of evidence, and I'm going to look for the reasons to validate my own beliefs about Northwestern and ignore those about my Big Ten brethren. Again, that's a fairly neutral one, but if you pay any attention to the political discourse these days and the cultural and public conversations that we're having, there's a lot of bad that comes from things like confirmation bias. And so I want to kind of continue in that vein. I think the way bias impacts race fits in that category of the bad ways that these cognitive biases imprint on our minds when we're young and impact us. At this point, I'd really like to be able to show you a video. That was one of the main reasons I wanted to try to get my PowerPoint to work. There's a wonderful video that we will share with you in the links that is a psychologist, Jennifer Eberhardt, an African-American woman at Stanford, who's done some of the most important work on implicit bias. She's worked with police departments and schools and a host of other institutions trying to address particularly racism and the ways these biases form around race. And so I was hoping to let her introduce some of these ideas and concepts. I will try to do the best I can now verbally, but it won't be as powerful as the way she does it.
Excuse me, this is Chip. Would you like me to try sharing my screen? I pulled up the video that you were showing.
That would be wonderful if you could show the first 2 or 3 minutes. That would be wonderful.
Okay, just a second.
So while he's pulling that up, she talks about an experience with her son. And a lot of our biases, particularly around race, are about physical appearance, and they're often triggered by something as simple as a face. And so you'll hear how this impacted Jennifer Eberhardt. You heard her describe one of the most striking cognitive biases that researchers like Dr. Eberhardt have found regarding the way race imprints on our minds. And it's this connection between a black face and violence, crime, fear. It's one of the most troubling findings. You also heard a little bit in there in the beginning of her story, the way cognitive biases impact how we recognize faces. We learn as young children how to navigate the faces around us. We're drawn to faces. Our facial recognition is a major part of our cognitive apparatus. And we learned to identify faces that are like our own, or that are like the people around us that care for us. And we struggle to identify with faces outside of those social groups that we were raised with. These are all some of the ways these biases imprint on our minds. Let me go a step further in some other biases that Dr. Eberhardt and researchers doing similar work have found. So I'd like to have an image here of a sharp-dressed African-American man wearing a nice suit with a nice watch, hair done well, sharp-looking glasses, and imagine with me he's a Harvard graduate, making maybe 6 figures in his professional work after he graduated from Harvard. Well, research on implicit bias has shown us that image shown to many people would assume that individual was raised in a poor or a bad neighborhood, simply because of the physical appearance, the racial appearance, the social structure of Blackness. Likewise, if he were to submit his resume alongside a white Princeton graduate, research has shown the Princeton graduate, because they're white, whether it's an image or a name, is much more likely to get brought back for a second interview and likely would be offered a higher salary if offered the job than a Black counterpart. And so there's all of these ways that these implicit biases, these narratives form in us, these stereotypes get embedded in our minds and impact us in our day-to-day interaction with other people. One other example of how implicit bias and race connect is it happens in our classrooms. And researchers have shown that, you know, if you're in a classroom and let's say there's an incident between two individuals, one white and one Black, and the teacher's attention is drawn to it, the initial reaction of the teacher, regardless of what racial category they identify with, is going to assume the darker skinned child caused the trouble, not the white child. Has no bearing on what actually happened in the situation. These are these biases, these narratives that we pick up from our culture, from the media, from the world around us, and they impact how young children are treated in school. And they impact at all these other levels, all of the kinds of inequalities that Dr. Fuller was talking about. These things are imprinted in our minds through these biases that we have, through these cognitive shortcuts. So what do we do about them? Let me spend just a quick minute here. So the hard part here is psychologists don't have here's a retreat, here's an intervention, here's 6 steps to overcoming your biases. Once these biases imprint on us, they're pretty permanent. They're going to be a part of how we navigate the world in most cases. Maybe eventually researchers will discover a way that we can begin to overcome them, but right now I'm not really aware of them. And so what do the researchers tell us to do then? Because obviously these are not good things. These are things we need to try to decrease their impact on us and on our society. Well, one thing that I think is fairly clear is we have to think intentionally about how we raise our children from very, very young ages, to see if there's ways that we can reduce the formation of bias in our kids and in subsequent generations. How do we put them in situations where they don't form these associations? How do we manage what media they consume so that these perceptions, that these stereotypes don't embed in their minds? Another area that Dr. Eberhardt and others have been heavily involved in uses language like friction or like slowing down. So our immediate reaction is often the one that has the bias. But if we can pause and think more clearly and look, that example I had of the gentleman, he has a nice watch on, he's dressed in a several $100 suit. Maybe that initial perception I had is wrong. They encourage us to find ways to slow things down and to create friction. And oftentimes what they're doing with organizations is helping to create protocols that force that. This is the process that you must go through. So Eberhardt tells the story of working with a neighborhood watch virtual service. And she helped them change their system where you could not identify a suspicious person by the color of their skin. You could not notify the system that there was a person of color on my sidewalk. You had to clearly explain a suspicious behavior. And that reduced racial profiling on this platform by 75%. And so coming up with the right protocols is another way that we can deal with this. The last one is we are a church audience. I think we have to take seriously our understanding of human nature as fallen, the reality of sin that is within all of us. And I truly believe these biases, the negative ones, are that unconscious sin that we sometimes talk about, that we confess corporately in the prayers of confession. At least that's something we do regularly in my church. And we need to trust in God's power to forgive us. and God's redeeming grace to begin to change this situation and to help us as the body of Christ begin to make change in the world. But I think it's important for us to be aware that race has this impact on us. It's a social construct. It's not a biological reality, but it imprints in very pernicious ways on our minds. And we have to understand that. We have to learn to live with that. And over time, we have to learn how to change that, because it is a major factor in why systemic racism and inequality continue in our culture. And so with that, I'm gonna stop and allow us to move to some Q&A or to breakouts.
Well, I don't know if you can hear me or see me. I don't know what's going on with my iPad, but I disappeared and I cannot get my camera back on. So if you can hear me, I think that in the interest of time, perfect. In the interest of time, maybe we can do a 10-minute breakout and then come back. Are back with very little time to spare. So if every group can give me one thing that came out of your discussion, I'm going to start. I think it was John who mentioned at the end that these disparities that we see and these problems that we see, it simply breaks our hearts, and it's difficult to know how to address them. Group one. Or was I group one? I don't know.
I think mine was group one, and we heard some interesting input. The Heather Mickelwright mentioned that she had never heard the nursery rhyme or the jump rope rhyme, and how sometimes the lack of clearly bigoted remarks like that make it harder for us to recognize the race that's, I'm gonna, something got a fire drill going on here. I'm going to mute myself. But anyway, thank you. Go on to the next.
Excellent. Next, group two. Representative from group two.
Was that me? I don't remember if that was the group I was in. I just didn't see the number, but is that right, Stephen?
Go ahead.
Yeah. So I listened to all this report, what I heard, because I'm from Science for the Church. I thought one of the key things was relationships, making sure we get into relationships. Flo mentioned also sometimes before you can address implicit bias, to do some work to recognize that you have implicit bias. So I think there was a Harvard piece that you did to help with that in your congregation, I believe, but not just in race, which is obviously important, but ageism, et cetera, all the ways, the categories we have. And then I think it was Joe, I believe, had a challenge to us. If our congregations aren't as diverse as they could be racially, yet our community is more diverse in our congregations, can we reach out and work toward representing the diversity in our community? That was just a few of the insights, but I learned a lot. So thank you to my group.
Excellent. If anybody's interested in taking the Harvard Implicit Association test, I think it's implicit.harvard.edu, and you will find a gazillion of them. They're totally free. So I'm just going to put it in here. The last group.
I think that's probably our group, and I think it's fair to say we moved pretty quickly to, what do we do about these biases? What are things we can do within the church? And I don't think we had any real clear ideas, but there were two suggestions at the end I thought were really valuable. And one is the importance, as was said elsewhere, of relationships, of building connections with other groups. So I think that is one, both within our congregation and outside. But then there was also the suggestion that we make sure we understand the problem before we try to fix it, because we might just create new problems by trying to solve it too soon. So I think that's some wisdom as well for us to consider.
Excellent. Drew, that will be last word for today. We're coming to 127, and just wanted to share with you, thank you for your attention and your time and coming and sharing with us. At Science for the Church, we are interested in helping you and your congregation address some of these issues. So if you go to our site, that's scienceforthechurch.org, you can find resources that will help you address some of these issues. You can also sign up for our weekly newsletter to be kept up to date with the information that we're putting out there to help you and your congregations. We also do consulting work and presentations in your church if you are interested. So just go to our site and drop us a note, and we will be more than happy to engage with you. Did I miss anything, Drew or Greg?
I think just one other thing, many of you opted to sign in for our newsletter, so you may have already received one on Tuesday. If you did not receive it on Tuesday, you can sign up through our website if you're interested in getting it. And then the last piece I just want to repeat, we're going to send out a bibliography to everybody that registered that's got lots of resources, videos, articles that will help you dig deeper on all of the themes that were addressed last week and this week. So we hope those will support you as you continue to try to understand and wrestle with these issues as we work together to end racism.
Great.
I have a question. This is being recorded? Will we be able to see these recordings?
Chip, I think you are more qualified to answer that question.
Yes, Drew, remind me if Dr. Fuller gave us her permission.
I don't think I remembered to ask, so I will follow up with that and seek her permission.
The first weeks will be on our YouTube and I'll put it in our newsletter and in our Facebook and things like that. So the one from last week is ready to post. Thank you for asking that.
She had at the end of her resume 3 different references on race and medicine, part 2, part 3, and COVID-19
Those
conversations.
resources-
So she published those.
Yep, and her list of resources from that slide are all in the document we will send you, so that
Okay.
if you didn't get a chance to write down those links, they're all copied and included there.
All right. So I think that this is it for us. Chip, I'll give it back to you so you can do any closing remarks. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Let's just do some happy
Thank
hands
you.
for Science for the Church. We're grateful for you and for your ministry. And we will look forward to seeing you another time with our workshops
Excellent.
into the covenant. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Hey.
Is that you who turned on our?
Yes. Ran as fast as I could.
Right.
Oops. So I have
Sorry
another
about the
meeting
tech
that I need to go
issues.
to. No, it's okay. I think people are patient about stuff like that.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. I need to run to another meeting, but thank you very much. I think it went very well. I love Dr. Fuller. She was great, really great. So knowledgeable and gracious and just wonderful.
Yep, and I hope that being local there in Michigan, but I'm happy to make a connection if there's other ways the Synod would like to leverage her and people like her.
Yeah.
As you continue to do further work.
Yeah. Thank you. I got to run to my next meeting, but it's not without a lot of gratitude. So thank you very, very
Thank you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And the check is in the mail.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.